Charles Moscowitz here. Let me just make sure my levels are good. Yes, okay, there it is. All right. Thank you very much, Charles Moscowitz. Welcome to the program. I am doing this thing quite loyally at this point. Monday through Friday, 10 p.m. to midnight, although on Fridays, I'm generally not going live because it's Shabbos and I want to be with my family and observe the wonderful rules of the Torah. So on Friday night, you'll get a rerun of the program. But otherwise, I am engaging in this great experiment of live, what we might euphemistically call radio, although there is no radio. This is obviously an internet program. And I do so with the goal of developing a live and interactive experience with an audience and with other people of like mind who care about issues and who like to discuss issues. So if you want to participate in the program, you can, first of all, live chat me and I will respond on Rumble. Rumble is the flagship station here. I'm probably going to shut down YouTube. I'm running YouTube right now, but I don't know how long I'm going to stay on there because I'm concerned about censorship on YouTube. But for the time being, I'm there. And so I can take chats on YouTube as well. And also, but most significantly, I can take phone calls. You can call in to this program and be heard. Let me just make sure my Skype is functioning here. Yeah, there we go. SKYPE. And the number to call is 617-396-4958. 617-396-4958. Now, obviously, the subject du jour, if I may use a French term, is the possibility that we may be falling into a world war. What could be more important than that? The invasion by Russia of Ukraine could move beyond simply a regional conflict, and it could turn into a world war. No one supports Russia invading Ukraine. But what I would suggest is, first of all, that there are two sides to the story. And I would also suggest that the United States has no interest in it. And I say that with a lot of trepidation and concern because innocent people are being killed. And I feel like it's not in our nature to stand back and allow that to happen. So it doesn't give me any great joy to express my opinion in that regard. I say that, however, because I am not sure that the United States, and for that matter, Western Europe, really wants to go to war against the nuclear-powered Russian Empire. That is a world war. It's not because I'm cowardly, but it's because I'm concerned about American men and women in uniform. I am concerned that such an involvement could escalate a conflict that ought to be handled locally. Let the Ukrainians and the Russians work out their own solution. They are meeting apparently at a place on the border of Belarus. And I think that if the Ukrainians get the message that the world is not going to come in and start dropping nuclear bombs and sending troops, then they will come to terms with Russia and there will be an equitable settlement. Russia has reasons for attacking Ukraine. It isn't just something that's happening by accident. I mentioned the other day that both the left and the right are wrong about this war, in my opinion. I got shut down from TikTok for mentioning this, but I'm going to mention it again. The left is agitating for war. They're saber rattling. They want to send American young men and women, pretty much the MAGA crowd, frankly, not themselves, off to fight a war in the middle of Europe and Asia. And they're doing so because of the claim that Vladimir Putin is like Hitler and Russia is like Nazi Germany, that they want to conquer the Eastern Europe, and they want to push forward and into Europe, and that they want to create an international empire. Ultimately, they want to conquer the world, which does describe National Socialism. That was a utopian socialist political experiment that sought to change human nature. They believed in so-called progress, that they could advance mankind, by biologically creating a superior species of human beings. It was very Darwinian in that way, and that they owed it to the world. They had like this kind of belief that they were basically functioning as good agents by doing this. And the left was right about that. That is what Hitler believed. And Hitler's invading taking over Czechoslovakia was the first move toward the dominance of all of Europe and the coordination with other dominating empires like Japan to control the entire world. I don't think there's any question about that. The right, their theory is based upon the thesis of Soviet defector Anatoly Golitsyn, who defected to the United States in the late 1970s and who authored a book called New Lies for Old, where he stated, and this is classic with the John Birch Society, that the Russians, are secret communists, that at some point they're going to shed their communist image and they're going to claim that they're good, Westerners. They're going to say communism had been defeated. But the truth is that they will still be secret communists, and they will still be involved basically in the same agenda that the Nazis were involved in, except instead of international control of the world through a biologically superior species of man, what Hitler called the Übermensch, they would create a dictatorship of the proletariat, a complete redistribution of the world's resources, which they viewed as finite and limited, and a creation of a collective empire and world where, as Karl Marx said, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, everyone would be de facto equal. They also were utopian, and they also were internationalist, and they believed that they were acting morally by subjecting and subduing the part of the world that disagreed with them. There are also echoes in radical Islam that resonate with this idea that the world is divided between the world Dar el-Ab, the world of war, and Dar es-Salam, the world of peace being the world under the subjugation of Islamic power, the Caliph, and the Dar el-Ab, the part of the world that has not yet submitted, that the very word Islam means to submit. Now, I don't believe that most 99% of Muslims believe that. I don't think. I pray they don't. But that was the philosophy and the belief of the radical jihadists who attacked the United States on September the 11th of 2001. And they're still around. Let's not pretend otherwise. We have to understand the nature of these international globalist socialistic ideas that animate movements that seek to control others to control nations, to control the world. I will go one step further here, and I hope that I don't get taken down from YouTube for this. But I would suggest that there is a similar agenda, not quite as violent, not as severe, not as dangerous, that has existed, well, besides the fact that it's existed in every generation going all the way back to Adam and Eve. It has existed in the world starting around the turn of the 20th century, and that is the Anglo-American establishment idea that was originally coined by people like Cecil Rhodes and John Ruskin and their American counterparts, like Andrew Carnegie. And that they believed in an informal world control without the open conquest of nations and of institutions of freedom and culture, but through subversion, through a quiet control of the world's resources informally. This has been called euphemistically the administrative state. In fact, Steve Bannon used those terms when he was an advisor to President Trump. It's kind of a interface between government and this sort of amorphous private entity that is made up of financial, political, social, and even religious and moral components, and that they have a revolving door that goes between the two. It's what we call the establishment, to put it in blunt terms. And there's nothing wrong with having an establishment, but when the establishment reaches such a level of intersection with government and intersection with international establishments, it becomes dangerous to freedom. I think it's this very establishment that I believe was engaged in overreach during the pandemic. Now, I'm not going to go into details on that. Suffice to say that President Trump bucked this establishment, which was why he was taken out, and that the only way we're going to get to the bottom of their agenda with regard to the pandemic, the lockdowns, the face covering, the passports, the forced vaccines, all of it. The only way we're going to get to the bottom of it is if the Republicans win the midterm election. And I believe they will. And if enough MAGA Republicans are part of that victory to make a difference. And again, I believe that there will be. Because if that happens, and that election is only, 7-8 months away from now, this is March 3rd today, so that's March to November. That's 7 months. Then we may have a possibility that there will be public investigations with televised hearings and testimony with regard to everything that went down during the pandemic, what was real and what was not real, what was science and what was politics, what was true and what was false. And only then will we be able to take back our rights and our freedoms and make sure that what happened during the pandemic will never happen again. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't take precautions to take care of ourselves. I believe we should. And I'm not against the vaccine necessarily. I mean, I've had the vaccine. I'm not anti-vax. I simply would note that this idea of this overarching governmental control and enforcement and mandates, what they call, is something that it was unnecessary mostly, I would suggest. I don't know that, but the only way we're going to find out is with an investigation. And if we do find that out, and I believe we will, then we will never have that happen again. And that if, God forbid, there's another variant or another event, then we will, as sovereign citizens under God, operating within the context of freedom, we will be able to make up our own minds in terms of how we protect ourselves and our own health. and that will be based upon our own unique conditions. But the only way we're going to get there is if we get to the truth about what happened. All right, but I want to get back to talking about what I hope does not happen, and we all pray doesn't happen, which is that we now seem to be sliding in the direction of a world war. These are very dangerous times. Now, I'm not going to stay on that long tonight, but I want to just give out the phone number. If you'd like to call in, you're welcome to do so. 617-396-4958 is the number. 617-396-4958. You can comment on Rumble. I am live on Rumble right now. Go to my Rumble station, please, and subscribe on Rumble, because Rumble is the most reliable of all of the stations so far. They're the least censorious of all of the stations. Let me just shut this off. But I am live. It looks like I am live on YouTube. So I just want to make sure the sound, the volume is down. Yeah, there we go. And so you can comment on YouTube as well. Oswald Spangler, Mr. Global. Oswald Spangler, thank you for commenting. Madam Texas Patriot. Hi, Charles. Hi, Madam Texas Patriot. Thank you for commenting. Oswald Spangler is an interesting choice of names, if I may say so. He was I believe he was an English philosopher in the late 19th century who posited the idea that he derived from the philosophy of Hegel, where he viewed the nation state, because Hegel viewed the nation state as almost having a divine element to it, which is not really the American view of the nation state. Americans, we view the nation state simply as a vehicle to protect our freedoms as citizens under God. The state itself is not a divine entity. The state itself is a man-made entity that we have the right to enter into and change or leave if it no longer serves our purposes. But Spangler, drawing from Hegel, believed that the state was almost something that had its own life, and that he talked about the state as having a birth, an adolescence, a flowering, an adulthood where it would reach the pinnacle of its strength, and then it would go through a decline and it would eventually die. Okay, Spangler was a German high school teacher, thank you, whose great-grandmother was Jewish, and he totally wasn't a Nazi. I don't think he was a Nazi either. I think he actually was probably more of a progressive. I never heard anyone say he was a Nazi. But I think that he was, he represented this kind of modern view of the nation state, as I was saying. Oswald, you're welcome to comment further. In fact, if you'd like, you can call in. I actually take calls here. 617-396-4958. 617-396-4958. I don't see any messages yet on Rumble. You're welcome to comment on Rumble. So getting back to my speculation about why we are sliding toward World War. The Russians and Putin are not either like Hitler, which is the left-wing claim, nor are they secret communists, nor are they like Stalin, which is the right-wing claim. I believe that Putin, and maybe I'm way off base here because I don't know this, I'm going only on what is in front of us, and of course that can be wrong and misleading, but based upon his actions, his comments, his policies since he's been in power, even putting aside the fact that he was a communist and a KGB agent, I believe that Vladimir Putin is a Russian nationalist and is a Russian Orthodox Christian. And in that sense, he is cut of the same cloth as Russian nationalists and Russian Orthodox Christians, going all the way back to Ivan the Terrible, going all the way back to the days of the Kievan Rus. Let's not forget, Russia was founded by Vikings. Then they became Eastern Orthodox when they accepted the orthodoxy of Constantinople, which was the Eastern Roman Empire, and they saw themselves as inheriting the Roman Empire. That's why the Romanovs were called, they took that last name. The Tsar, the term Tsar means Caesar in Russian. And I think that they combined that belief in a unified state that inherited the Roman mantle with their Orthodox Christianity. And I think that Orthodox Christianity is different than Western Christianity, as in Catholicism and the Protestant churches, in that it is very state-oriented. It combines this idea of the state. Talk about Oswald Spengler viewing the state as having a life. I mean, the Russians viewed their state as having a religious aspect to it, like a divine aspect, and that it was on a religious mission. I suppose in a way it's similar to, okay, that's fine. It's similar to Judaism, and I suppose in that way, in that Judaism, we view the existence of the state of Israel as having a divine element to it. It's not just an ordinary sovereign secular state. It's a state that we were commanded to create by God, and that we are doing so to create a spiritual commonwealth that will, be servants of God, and as such be examples for all of mankind by serving God. And part of God's command is that we assume control of that tiny little swath of land between the Jordan River and the Great Sea, which is Israel. And I think Russia views itself that way. If you look at the history of Russia, it's been a very large solitary state, as opposed to Western Europe, which has never been, they didn't develop a sense of nationalism in Western Europe really until the 18th century. In fact, Germany and Italy really didn't even unify until the late part of the 19th century, like 100 years after the US Constitution, more than that. And if you look at countries like Britain and France and Spain and Austria, they were basically more like the property of their kings and their dukes and their princes and their they had all their levels of aristocracy, and that they were created out of marriages between families and dynasties and hereditary monarchs. And it was really only later that they started to develop this idea of the state. So you have Putin and Russia basically continuing on in this tradition that has been going back 1,000 years, this religio-nationalist state. The communists tried to destroy that. The Soviet Union, first they tried to destroy it, then they thought they could exploit it by using Russia as a stepping stone to conquer the world. There's no question that that's what communism is. It's very much, as I started, like Nazism and like radical Islam in that way. And it failed. It collapsed. And now you have Russia back to its nationalist Christian personality and identity. So I'm bringing this up only to state that I don't believe, and of course I could be dead wrong here, believe me, and I don't think anyone knows for sure, but we have a right to speculate. I don't believe that um, Russia has designs on Europe. They don't have designs on the rest of the world. I think that they have designs on their immediate neighborhood. I think the same is to a certain extent true of China, by the way. I don't think China seeks to conquer the world either. I think they expect to be in control of their own destiny. These are nationalistic states and movements. China, unfortunately, is also animated by communism, which is problematic. But Russia, I don't believe they are seeking anything beyond their sphere of influence. And I would contend that Ukraine is within that sphere of influence. That doesn't mean that Ukraine doesn't have all the right to be sovereign. It does. So I support Ukrainian sovereignty. But Ukrainian sovereignty ought to be understood in the context that Ukraine should not expect to be aligning itself too vigorously with enemies of Russia. And the enemies of Russia, philosophically, culturally, politically, even militarily, or certainly militarily, but also even religiously, is the West, is the United States and Western Europe. Russia sees itself very differently. They operate in a very, very different context. And so when they see Ukraine moving to the West and forming military alliances with its enemies, which would basically put Western Europe and even the United States on their border, I mean, let's not forget the 1,000-mile Ukraine-Russia border is long, and it goes right into the very heart of Russia. It goes right up to the Volga River. It goes up to the Urals practically. It dips into the Caucasus. It is on the outskirts even of Moscow. That Russia has genuine concern that a westernization of Ukraine will threaten not only their military position, but their very cultural survival. So look, I am only bringing this up to try to understand the dynamics of the conflict and to note that we ought to understand this as a way to avoid getting into a world war. We ought to offer our offices as peaceful, neutral, negotiating offices to try to bring about an equitable peace between the two countries. I think that hopefully that will happen if Ukraine agrees that they're not going to align themselves with the West. So when you have the comedian actor who is now the president of Ukraine and who once actually acted in a movie as president of Ukraine, joining the European Union, talking about joining NATO, these are provocations for Russia. That's not going to help bring about peace. What will bring about peace is if Ukraine stops those kinds of ambitions and goes back to being a sovereign state operating with respect for the orbit in which they exist. Now, that doesn't mean that they have to give up sovereignty, okay? And I've given this example yesterday. I'll do it again today. Finland. Finland actually fought a war with Russia before World War II. It was the Russo-Finnish War in the Winter War of 1940. Finland allied themselves very openly with Nazi Germany, which was an enemy of Russia, even while they were allies or they had a peace treaty. After the war, Finland agreed that in order to preserve their sovereignty and not face off against a very, very powerful Soviet Union that had been emboldened by their victory over the Nazis, that they would take a neutral posture with regard to the West. They would not be part of NATO. They would not be a part of the European Union. They would be neutral, and they would basically informally tilt toward Russia when dealing with foreign policy and even dealing with cultural issues. Like, let's not forget that Helsinki, the capital of Finland, is only like a 1 hour drive between Helsinki and Leningrad, which is Russia's second largest city, today Petersburg. And so Finland did this after the war. And the result is that they were not taken over by Russia. They did not become communist. And they went on to become an extraordinarily successful state. A startup nation, if you will. I mean, all these innovations and technologies, and they enjoy a very high standard of living, and they enjoy all the benefits of freedom because of this. There's no reason why Ukraine can't take that same posture. They don't need to be involved in waving a saber at Russia. There's nothing positive to be gained by that. So then who is behind this aggressive and provocative policy on the part of Ukraine? Well, let's take a look briefly. In 2014, the president of the Ukraine, Yanukovych, who was pro-Russian and who, we can look at propaganda saying he was corrupt. Okay, fine. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. But what we do know is that he was elected. He was popular in Ukraine. He was the legitimate head of state. He was overthrown by a coup d'etat. Poroshenko came in the Maidan Square protest, and he was removed. He had to flee. He left. He basically settled in Russia. And at that point, who was behind the coup d'etat? There was a lot of speculation that the European Union was there, that NATO might have had a hand in it, that this billionaire from Hungary, I'm not going to mention his name, might have had a hand in it. He's been accused of having a hand in Hungarian politics and even in American politics. We're not going to go there because I'm running live on YouTube. Well, suffice to say, there were, according to More Than Rumor, Western interests that were behind that coup. And that after the coup, the government began to move into the Western orbit. They began to apply for membership in the EU and in NATO. You ended up having a rise in corruption. Burisma Oil. Need I say more? Again, I don't want to get in trouble at YouTube, but you had big companies and oligarchs in Ukraine having interactions with Western and even some American oligarchs and political figures. Get it? I'm not going to say more. And you had an increase in corruption. There's also been talk about child trafficking and sex slavery and a lot of that stuff. Again, I'm not going to go there because we're on YouTube. But suffice to say that Russia responded by seizing the Crimea, where Russia had important naval ports in Sevastopol in particular that gave them access to the Mediterranean and that were important to them militarily. And they had basically a lease arrangement on that port, and that the new Ukrainian government, from what I understand, was threatening to cancel that lease. So they seized all of Crimea, which apparently is predominantly ethnically Russian anyways. And they began to agitate on the eastern part of the Ukrainian border, where you had Russian speakers in Donetsk and Luhansk, which are more Russian-oriented provinces. And yet Ukraine continued to rattle the saber. They continued to threaten to get nuclear weapons and to drag the United States and Western Europe into a war. And so now we have the present war. What I would suggest, and I'm not going to stay on too much longer here, but what I would suggest is that we offer our diplomatic services and stop with the rattling of the saber. I actually think that President Biden deserves some credit. I mean, he seemed to be more moderate in his State of the Union address, and that he's not totally cutting off all aid to Russia. He's not, they didn't shut down the banking system. They're not taking those kinds of extreme measures, which are acts of war. Let's not forget we did that to Japan just before Pearl Harbor. Those were acts of war when we shut off all oil and all gas to Japan. That provoked Japan. We're not doing that. We shouldn't do it. It's not in our interest to do it. Instead, we ought to offer our services as a neutral third party to help negotiate peace, and that Ukraine ought to achieve peace and a sort of a casus belli with Russia under the understanding that they're not going to join NATO, they're not going to join the EU, and that they're going to respect the fact that they live in Russia's neighborhood and get on with their sovereignty, get on with their lives, and not be involved in these rather questionable intrigues that are basically possibly being managed by questionable interests, as I mentioned. So I think on that note, I'm going to wrap it up for today. Nationalism is an 1800s construct. This is on YouTube. Oh, I disagree. I think that nationalism is the most progressive idea to emerge in human society. The nation state is critical to freedom. It's critical to our ability as citizens to control our own lives and to determine our own destiny. We have a right as people to develop our own culture, our own language, our own freedom of faith, all of the freedoms that we enjoy as sovereign citizens under God happen because we have a nation state that we established to protect those freedoms. Nationalism today is more relevant than ever. Now, the American version of nationalism is different than the Russian version that I described, this kind of idea that the state is divine and whatnot. The American idea of nationalism is a kind of a respect for our culture, our history, our traditions, our language, our faith, but at the same time, a very healthy distrust of political power. We don't worship government. That's what the left does. They want the government to run everything. They're hyper-nationalists, nationalized healthcare, nationalized welfare, nationalized education, nationalized everything, right? We as Americans, the American philosophy is that our rights come from God and that we give the government, the state, a very limited grant of power to only do very specific things that are set out in a written document called the Constitution. So, that's the American form of nationalism, and that's the form of nationalism that works for us. We don't have a right to impose that on others, but as imperfect as it is, it works for us. Defend the Constitution. Yes, I agree. I couldn't agree more. The West is the best. I agree with that too, but we don't have a right to impose ourselves on the East. If we want to enjoy our sovereignty, we have to protect the sovereignty of others. Okay, so I'm going to kind of wrap it up. I'll just give out the number one more time. You're welcome to comment on the YouTube channel. I'm getting a lot of comments here. Thank you very much. And you're also welcome to comment on Rumble, which is the flagship station. And I appreciate it if you would join me on Rumble and subscribe on Rumble. I know that people generally aren't used to subscribing on things that they're not used to subscribing on. You have Rumble's growing, but at the same time, people who are used to YouTube, they stay with YouTube. But I would ask you to consider subscribing to me on Rumble because I'm doing some programming coming up, frankly, that I will not be running on YouTube because of censorship. So if you really want to get the real story and my real program as it develops, I would urge you to join me on Rumble and subscribe to my Rumble station, okay? That's where the action is as far as this program is concerned. And of course, that just go to Rumble, and the station is rumble.com/Moscowitz, like Moscow, Moscowitz. And let me just give out the phone number one more time. You're welcome to call 617-396-4958, 617-396-4958. This is a live program. I don't have sponsors other than my own books. I'm sponsored by myself. And I don't ask for donations like a lot of people do. What I ask for, I don't ask for it, but I offer, are my books, which are available at Amazon Books or at Barnes & Noble Books. They're soft covers and they're ebooks. They're not expensive. I think that the ebooks run about $2 or $3, and the soft covers run about $7 or $8, maybe $9. And to purchase my books, you get a piece of my mind. You get a value for that, and you support my efforts in terms of doing this program. So anyway, on that note, I want to thank everyone for joining me this evening. God bless all of you. God bless this great country of ours. And let's pray for peace in Ukraine and pray for peace in the world. Thank you very much, everybody. Good night, everybody. Okay. And